Picture this: a city with no walls, no towering stone defenses, no gates, no moat. And yet for centuries nobody dared attack it. Why? Because the walls of this city were its men, the most feared soldiers in the ancient world. This was Sparta. We all know the legend. 300 men at Thermopylae standing against an empire. Warriors raised to fear nothing but cowardice itself. Sparta was the superpower of ancient Greece, respected and feared in equal measure. But empires don't fall in a single battle. They rot from the inside first. And Sparta's fall is one of history's most fascinating slow-motion collapses. A story of shrinking numbers, broken traditions, and one battle that shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility forever. This is the story of how the toughest city in the ancient world faded from a superpower into a museum piece. Let's get into it. To understand Sparta's fall, you first need to understand what made it rise. Around the 7th century BCE, Sparta conquered its neighbor Messenia and enslaved much of its population. These enslaved people, called helots, actually outnumbered Spartan citizens by a wide margin. Some estimates suggest as many as 7-1. That single fact shaped everything about Spartan society. To control a population that vastly outnumbered them, the Spartans didn't build bigger walls. They built better soldiers. Spartan society transformed into a military machine known as the agoge. Boys as young as 7 were taken from their families for brutal state-run training. Underfed on purpose, whipped for getting caught stealing food, taught obedience and endurance above all else. The result was the finest heavy infantry, the hoplites in the Greek world. Sparta's army wasn't just skilled, it was professional. In an age when most Greek soldiers were farmers who picked up spears part-time. But here's the catch nobody mentions in the highlight reel. This system only worked with a strict sufficient number of full Spartan citizens, called Spartiates, and that number was always fragile. By 404 BCE, Sparta stood at the top of the Greek world. After nearly 3 decades of brutal warfare, the Peloponnesian War finally ended with Sparta defeating its great rival Athens. Spartan general Lysander sailed into Athens harbor, tore down the city's long walls to the music of flutes, and forced Athens into humiliating surrender. For the first time in its history, Sparta was the unchallenged hegemon of Greece. Its garrisons and backed governments, including the infamous 30 tyrants in Athens, spreading Spartan influence everywhere. It should have been the start of a golden age. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. Sparta had built its identity around fighting wars close to home. Now it was managing an empire, garrisoning distant cities and getting entangled in conflicts far beyond its borders, including a costly war against Persia. Spartan soldiers and Spartan wealth began bleeding out in every direction, and behind the scenes something even more dangerous was happening. Sparta was running out of Spartans. Historians call it oliganthropia, a Greek term for a simple deadly problem: population decline. At its height, Sparta could field around 8,000 to 10,000 Spartiate warriors. By the 4th century BCE, that number had collapsed to a fraction of that. Some accounts suggest as low as 1,000. Why? Constant warfare picked off trained soldiers generation after generation, and the citizen pool was already small. Spartan inheritance laws concentrated land in fewer hands over time, and if a Spartiate couldn't afford his required contribution to the communal messes, the syssitia, he lost his citizenship entirely. Rigid rules meant new Spartiates couldn't easily be replenished. So Sparta found itself in an impossible bind. An empire to run, but a shrinking army of full citizens to do it with. It leaned harder on allied troops and even armed some helots as light infantry, but the elite core, the thing that made Sparta Sparta, was quietly disappearing. Meanwhile, its aggressive foreign policy kept making enemies. King Agesilaus II campaigned against Persia, then got pulled home to fight the Corinthian War against Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos, partly funded, ironically, by Persian gold trying to keep the Greeks fighting each other. Sparta kept winning battles, but it was spending a currency it could not print more of: Spartan lives. For generations, Thebes had been a secondary power, often pushed around by Sparta. But in the 370s BCE, that started to change, thanks largely to the general Epaminondas, a military genius who studied Sparta's tactics closely, because to beat Sparta, you had to outthink it, not outmuscle it. In 371 BCE, tensions boiled over at a peace conference in Sparta itself. When Thebes refused certain terms, Sparta declared war and marched an army led by King Cleomenes I into Boeotian territory. The forces met near the small town of Leuctra. By the numbers, it looked like a mismatch. Traditional Greek battles lined hoplites up in a phalanx, shields locked, with the strongest troops on the right side of the line. An ancient rule almost everyone followed. Epaminondas broke it. Instead of an even line, he stacked his best troops, including the legendary Theban sacred band, in an unusually deep formation, 50 men deep on his left flank, directly facing Sparta's elite right wing where Cleomenes commanded, while holding back his weaker units on the right entirely. It's now studied as one of the earliest recorded uses of oblique order. The concentrated Theban wedge smashed into the Spartan right with overwhelming local force. King Cleomenes was killed in the fighting. Roughly 400 Spartiates died on that field. And remember, Sparta's entire pool of full citizens may have already shrunk to around 1,000. This wasn't just a lost battle. It was a demographic catastrophe and a psychological one. Sparta was supposed to be unbeatable in a straight infantry fight. That myth had just been ground into the dirt at Leuctra. Epaminondas wasn't finished. He understood something crucial. Sparta's power didn't just come from its soldiers. It came from the enslaved Messenian helots who farmed Spartan land, freeing citizens to train for war full-time. In the years following Leuctra, Epaminondas marched a coalition army deep into the Peloponnese, right into Sparta's backyard. For the first time in centuries, enemy soldiers stood on Spartan soil, and the city, still without walls, had no real way to stop them, surviving mostly on hasty defense and, some accounts suggest, sheer luck. Then came the real blow. Epaminondas helped found the city of Messenia and formally restored independence to the Messenian helots, who had farmed Spartan land and propped up the Spartan economy for roughly 3 centuries. Sparta lost close to half its territory and a huge portion of its economic base almost overnight. Without Messenian labor, it could no longer sustain the same number of full-time warrior citizens, even if its population had somehow recovered. Sparta would never again be a great power in Greece. Still dangerous in a fight, but no longer the state other cities feared above all others. The century that followed was a slow, painful readjustment. While Sparta nursed its wounds, the center of Greek power shifted north to Macedon. King Philip II built a new army. Long sarissa pikes, cavalry, and combined arms tactics that made the old hoplite phalanx look outdated. In 338 BCE, Philip crushed a coalition of Athens and Thebes at Chaeronea, ending independent Greek city-state power for good. Almost every city joined his League of Corinth, except Sparta. When Philip demanded submission, tradition holds the Spartans gave a famously short answer. Told that if he entered Laconia, he'd leave nothing standing, they reportedly replied with a single word: if. Pure bravado. And it worked mostly because Philip and later Alexander the Great judged a weakened, wall-less Sparta simply wasn't worth the trouble of conquering. Sparta kept its independence only because it had become too small and poor to be worth crushing. That's not the mark of a superpower. That's the mark of a city being politely ignored. Sparta got one final moment of ambition in the 3rd century BCE, under reform-minded King Cleomenes III. He looked at his shrunken, impoverished city and tried something radical. Canceling debts, redistributing land and expanding citizenship to rebuild the Spartiate army, retrained in newer Macedonian-style pike tactics. For a brief, thrilling stretch in the 200s BCE, Sparta clawed its way back into relevance, winning battles against the Achaean League. But the revival collided with the era's rising powers. The Achaean League called in help from Macedon itself, and in 222 BCE, the combined army crushed Cleomenes at the Battle of Silesia just north of Sparta. Cleomenes fled into exile in Egypt, where he later died. For the first time in its long history, Sparta was occupied by a foreign garrison. A brief, brave flicker before the light went back out. Over the following century, Sparta bounced between local squabbles and shifting alliances, growing weaker with each round. When Rome swept into Greece, Sparta had no leverage left to resist. By 146 BCE, Rome had crushed the Achaean League at Corinth and absorbed Greece. Sparta was now just another town under distant Roman oversight, allowed to keep old customs as a curiosity, almost a living museum exhibit for wealthy tourists fascinated by tales of the old warrior culture. Visitors still came to see Spartan discipline on display, including ritualized whippings of youths at the shrine of Artemis Orthia, though later accounts suggest the ritual had grown theatrical, more spectacle than the brutal training it once was. The substance of old Sparta had drained away, leaving only costume wearing the mask of a warrior state. The symbolic end came centuries later, in 396 CE. The Visigothic king Alaric, who would go on to sack Rome itself in 410 CE, swept his forces through Greece. Ancient sources describe Sparta, by then undefended and largely ceremonial, being sacked along with other cities in the region. There was no legendary last stand this time, no 300 warriors holding a mountain pass, just an old faded name on the map. Overrun like countless other towns caught in the collapsing edges of the ancient world. The city that once needed no walls because its men were its walls fell to a force that barely had to fight for it. The soldiers who might have stopped Alaric had been gone for 600 years. Bled out on the fields of Leuctra because the system that made Spartans had broken long before the enemy arrived. So what actually killed Sparta? Not one battle, not one enemy. It was a slow demographic bleed from a rigid citizenship system that couldn't replace its losses. It was an economy built on an enslaved population that eventually broke free. It was a refusal to adapt until the adaptation under Cleomenes came far too late. And it was a world that moved on to new armies and empires while Sparta kept polishing the memory of what it used to be. Sparta's fall is really a warning dressed up as ancient history. Any system that depends on an ever-shrinking elite and an ever-growing underclass beneath it eventually runs out of road. The Spartans who stood at Thermopylae would probably not recognize the quiet, tourist-trapped town their descendants lived in 600 years later. But maybe that's the most human part of this story. Empires don't usually die screaming. Most just fade. One lost battle, one broken tradition at a time, until the walls that were never built are finally, quietly gone. And that's the real story of the fall of Sparta. Not a single dramatic defeat, but centuries of cracks spreading beneath the surface of the most feared city in the ancient world. If you enjoyed this journey through history, leave a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the rise and fall of the ancient world's greatest powers. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.